Elijah Carter stepped out of the back door of the diner, wiping grease off his hands with a crumpled napkin as he zipped up his hoodie. The sun had barely risen, casting a dull orange glow over the empty sidewalks of his neighborhood. It had been another long shift, 7 hours of cleaning tables, scrubbing floors, and bagging leftovers just to earn enough to pay the electric bill. His legs ached, but his mind was already racing through legal case studies he'd been rereading during his break. The law had always been his dream, even if it was now on pause. He tucked his ID badge from the diner into his front pocket, alongside a crumpled bus transfer and his grandmother's prescription receipt. As he turned the corner toward his block, 2 police cruisers sped toward him and screeched to a halt. Officers jumped out, guns half drawn, barking orders before Elijah could even register what was happening. "Hands where we can see them! On your knees!" Startled, Elijah complied instantly, confused and terrified. He tried to speak, tried to explain he had just gotten off work, even reached for his badge, but was shoved to the ground and handcuffed before a word could fully leave his mouth. One officer muttered something about a burglary. Elijah blinked, stunned. A burglary? He hadn't even heard sirens all night. He didn't even own a car, let alone stolen property. They accused him of fitting the description of a suspect. Young black male in a hoodie. That was it. Elijah tried to plead with them, telling them to check his pockets, receipts, time card, ID, but they weren't listening. His voice didn't matter. His facts didn't matter. His hoodie had already decided the story for them. As they shoved him into the back of the van, his thoughts drifted to the courtroom, the one he used to dream of standing in, not being dragged into. Just a few years ago, he had been a top student at the city law school. First in mock trials, sharp in debate, already interning for a civil rights attorney. But then his grandmother fell ill. Hospital bills piled up. He left school to care for her, to work full-time. "You'll go back," she always said. "You're meant to wear the robe, not the chains." But now he was in chains. Inside the dark van, Elijah sat hunched, wrists tight behind his back, the cold metal cutting into his skin. He stared at his reflection in the scratched window. No one would believe him. Who would listen to a kid in a hoodie over 2 officers with badges? The van made a sharp turn. The courthouse was ahead. His heart pounded. A part of him wanted to cry, to scream, to disappear. But another part, the part trained in argument, in logic, in law, began to quietly take over. He remembered every Fourth Amendment clause, every case of unlawful arrest, every cross-examination technique he had once mastered in school. He would not beg. He would not break. If they wanted a case, he would give them one, but not as a criminal. As the doors of the van opened and daylight poured in, Elijah stepped down, not just as a man in cuffs, but as a man preparing to defend everything they thought he couldn't. Narration. In a world quick to judge a hoodie, no one asked what was underneath it. The courthouse buzzed with the usual chaos, shuffling feet, muttering voices, echoing cell doors. It smelled like old wood, sweat, and stale coffee. Elijah Carter was led through the narrow corridor with his hands still cuffed, wearing a hoodie stained from last night's diner shift and jeans that had seen better years. He kept his chin up, but inside, every step felt heavier than the last. They led him into courtroom 3B, where Judge Raymond Kellerman presided, famous among public defenders for his impatience, sarcasm, and general distaste for what he called street lawyers. The courtroom was already half full with people waiting on their cases, mothers clutching toddlers, men in faded uniforms, others just staring blankly at the floor. The moment Elijah stepped in, heads turned. The bailiff called his name. Elijah stood alone. The clerk scanned the file, frowned, and whispered to the judge. "Mr. Carter," Judge Kellerman said without looking up, "it appears you have no representation today. The public defender's office is overwhelmed, again. Your case has been delayed for intake." Elijah took a breath and stepped forward. His voice was clear, calm. Your Honor, I'd like to waive counsel and represent myself. There was a pause, then a ripple of laughter from the back benches. Even one of the officers who arrested him, seated nearby, let out a low chuckle. Judge Kellerman finally looked up, arching one eyebrow. Represent yourself? You do understand you're facing felony charges? I do, Elijah replied. And you believe you're qualified to speak in your own defense? I know my rights, Elijah said. I know the law. The laughter grew louder now. A woman near the back whispered, "He must be crazy." Someone else snorted. Even the stenographer cracked a smile. Kellerman leaned back in his chair, voice laced with sarcasm. What's next? Harvard law? A beat passed. Elijah didn't flinch. Actually, yes, he said. Until I had to choose family over tuition. The laughter stopped. The courtroom grew still. Judge Kellerman tapped his pen on the desk. You're telling me you went to Harvard? I was accepted, Elijah replied. Didn't finish. My grandmother had a stroke. I left school to take care of her. Worked nights. Tried to keep studying in between. The judge stared at him for a long moment. Then dryly, touching story. But this is a court of law, not a soap opera. I understand, Elijah said, and I'm ready to proceed. I'd like to enter a motion challenging the legality of my arrest and request dismissal based on unlawful detainment and lack of probable cause. The room was quiet now. Even the court reporter stopped typing. Motion denied, Kellerman said, but his tone had shifted, less mocking, more curious. But I'll allow you to continue. Let's see what you've got. Elijah nodded and stepped back, head held high. Somewhere deep in the courtroom, someone whispered, "Damn, he's serious." As the next case was called, Elijah stood alone but unwavering, a quiet fire in his eyes. He wasn't here to plead. He was here to prove what justice looked like when it spoke for itself. And for the first time, Judge Kellerman leaned forward, not out of authority, but interest. The gavel struck once, loud and sharp, signaling the start of the proceedings. Courtroom 3B settled into a hushed murmur as Elijah Carter stood beside the defendant's table, still wearing the same worn hoodie, but now holding a yellow legal pad filled with handwritten notes. The chain of disbelief still lingered in the air. No lawyer, no suit, just a young black man facing the law alone, yet refusing to look afraid. Judge Kellerman adjusted his glasses, resting his elbows on the bench. Mr. Carter, you've had time to review your charges. What's your move? Elijah stood tall, voice steady. Yes, Your Honor. I'd like to file a motion to dismiss all charges against me. The prosecutor scoffed audibly. Your Honor, the defense is wasting the court's time. He's not a licensed... Elijah didn't even look at him. On the grounds of insufficient probable cause and violation of my Fourth Amendment rights. There was a pause. Someone in the back coughed. Judge Kellerman raised one brow. You have a citation for that, Mr. Carter. Elijah nodded and flipped his notes. Terry v. Ohio, 392 U.S. 1. Officers lack specific and articulable facts to warrant a stop, let alone an arrest. They failed to conduct a proper field identification. Furthermore, the arresting officer provided no Miranda warning upon detainment, violating Miranda v. Arizona, 384 U.S. 436. The courtroom began to shift. Eyebrows lifted. Whispers stirred. This wasn't just boldness. It was preparation. The prosecutor fumbled through his papers, clearly caught off guard. Your Honor, that's a misinterpretation. Elijah cut in smoothly. I'm not debating interpretation, sir. I'm citing precedent. They never asked for identification, never confirmed my location. I had an ID badge from my job, receipts time-stamped from minutes before the alleged crime. And yet I was cuffed and hauled into custody based on nothing more than a vague description. The judge tapped his fingers against the bench. The gallery leaned in. "I find your delivery compelling," Judge Kellerman finally said. "But your motion is denied. The state has the right to pursue evidence. That said," he paused, eyeing Elijah like a chess master rethinking his opponent. "This court is curious to see what else you've got." Gasps rustled through the seats. Even the bailiff gave a sidelong glance. Elijah offered a faint nod, his expression unreadable, but inside he could feel it. The air was different now. He'd cracked the first layer of disbelief. No longer just the suspect. Now a presence, a force. Someone they had to actually listen to. The prosecutor's lips tightened. This was supposed to be routine, open and shut. But now he was facing a defendant who could outquote him on case law. The judge gestured toward the prosecution. "Call your first witness." As the arresting officer prepared to take the stand, Elijah sat down at the defense table, pen in hand. He wasn't a lawyer in their eyes, not yet. But the courtroom had stopped laughing, and the trial had just begun. The courtroom quieted as Officer Grant took the stand, his uniform pressed, his expression rigid. The prosecutor asked routine questions: date, time, sequence of arrest, and Grant responded with robotic confidence, recounting how he had responded to a burglary call and found Elijah lurking suspiciously near the scene. When it was Elijah's turn to cross-examine, he stood slowly, one hand resting on the defense table, the other holding a single page of notes. He approached with the calm of someone who had studied the game from the outside long enough to know when to start playing it better than those within. "Officer Grant," Elijah began, his tone polite but crisp. "How tall did you say the suspect was?" Grant didn't blink. "Approximately 6'2". Elijah stepped back, gesturing to himself. "And my height?" A pause. The officer looked him over. "Maybe 5'10"? 5'9", Elijah corrected. "So we're starting off with a 4-inch difference," the gallery murmured. "Can you describe the suspect's build as reported in the initial dispatch?" Grant hesitated. "Muscular, medium to large build." Elijah held up his arms, lanky and lean beneath the hoodie. "Would you describe me as muscular?" "Objection. Sustained," Judge Kellerman said flatly. "Rephrase." "Let me put it this way," Elijah said, undeterred. "In your professional opinion, do I physically match the suspect description you were given?" Grant shifted uncomfortably. "Not exactly, no." Another murmur. A reporter in the back scribbled something down. Elijah continued, calm but relentless. "At the time of arrest, did I resist? No. Did I flee? No. Did I carry any stolen property, tools, or suspicious items? No. So aside from wearing a hoodie, which half the city was that night, you had no clear reason to detain me." The officer's jaw tightened. "You fit a description." Elijah reached for a USB drive and handed it to the bailiff. "Your Honor, I request this surveillance footage from an ATM on Maple and 9th, timestamped 11:47 p.m., the exact time of the burglary call." Kellerman waved the clerk to proceed. The video played on the monitor. It showed Elijah, in the same hoodie, using an ATM, miles from the crime scene. The gallery stirred again, this time louder. A woman in the back whispered, "That's him! That's the same hoodie!" A man leaned over to his neighbor. "They arrested the wrong guy." Elijah looked back at Officer Grant. "Did you search for nearby surveillance to verify your identification?" "No, we acted on the information available." "But you didn't verify. You assumed." The officer looked to the prosecutor for rescue, but none came. Judge Kellerman leaned forward slightly, intrigued. "The footage appears clear. Timestamp and location confirm Mr. Carter was not at the scene." Elijah didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply said, "No further questions." He returned to his table, picking up his pen, like a sword returned to its sheath. The courtroom was no longer his enemy. It was his stage. Narration. He didn't need a gavel, just the truth. Sharpened into questions, the courtroom faded into silence, replaced by the hum of an old refrigerator and the soft clinking of teacups on mismatched saucers. Elijah's story didn't begin with a courtroom or a hoodie. It began in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of the city, where the scent of jasmine tea often drifted from the kitchen and gospel music played softly in the background. It was there, in a worn-down armchair with floral prints, that his grandmother sat most evenings, knitting beside a shelf lined with faded family photos and dusty law textbooks she'd picked up from a thrift store. His mother had died when he was just 8 years old. A car accident. A rainy night. Too many unanswered questions. All he remembered was holding her scarf to his face for weeks afterward, pretending she was still around. His grandmother, Ms. Ruth Carter, had taken him in, raised him with firm love and open hands. She had no degree, no savings, but she gave him what the world often forgot to offer young black boys: belief. At 14, Elijah discovered the law through a debate club at school. He devoured court cases like stories, memorizing quotes from Thurgood Marshall and Ruth Bader Ginsburg like lyrics from songs. By 17, he was winning city competitions. By 18, he had earned a full scholarship to a top law school, the first in his neighborhood to do so. But then, midway through his second semester, his world changed again. His grandmother collapsed in the kitchen. Stroke. The doctors said it would be a long recovery. Expensive therapy. Supervision. Medication. Insurance didn't cover most of it. He tried to juggle both. Law school by day, hospital visits by night. But something had to give. And so, with shaking hands, he signed a withdrawal form and walked away from the dream he'd chased his whole life. He never told his grandmother the truth. He just told her law school was on pause. He took a night job at a local diner, washed dishes, cleared tables, delivered orders. And in the small hours between shifts, he read, in laundromats, on buses, in stairwells. His copy of Black's Law Dictionary was missing its cover, and his criminal procedure casebook was held together with duct tape. But he never stopped. The dream had only gone quiet. It had not died. One night, while spooning soup into her trembling hands, his grandmother looked up at him with watery eyes. "You've got too much fire for this world to freeze you out, baby," she said softly. He smiled. "If they won't give us justice, I'll become it." She laughed then, a raspy, warm sound. "Then don't just speak like a lawyer," she said. "Fight like one." That sentence rooted itself deep in his soul. Years passed. The stroke took her memory little by little. She stopped recognizing him sometimes. But on good days, she'd look at him and say, "My boy's gonna change the world." And Elijah would whisper back, "I'm working on it." Now, back in the courtroom, her words echoed in his mind like a mantra. She never saw him stand at a trial, but every word he spoke, every motion he filed, every truth he unearthed, he did it as her grandson, her legacy, her fighter. And in that sense, she was there in the room, more present than anyone else. Day 3 of the trial arrived with an unusual energy. Word had spread. The courtroom, once half empty and indifferent, now had a buzz. Every seat filled, whispers flitting between rows. People weren't there to watch another conviction. They were there to witness something different, something rare. Elijah Carter stood tall at the defense table, wearing the same hoodie, but with a presence that felt heavier, more commanding. He no longer looked like a man trying to stay afloat. He looked like someone who had found his rhythm, his purpose, and the courtroom was beginning to see it too. "Your Honor," he said, voice clear and steady, "I'd like to call my next witness." Jamal Whitaker, a young man, stepped forward wearing thick glasses, a collared shirt tucked neatly into jeans. He looked slightly nervous but nodded to Elijah as he passed. then took the stand. "Please state your name and occupation," Elijah asked. "Jamal Whitaker. I'm a freelance cybersecurity analyst and data recovery technician. I specialize in timestamp authentication, geolocation forensics, and digital evidence recovery." The prosecutor raised an eyebrow, flipping through his file as if to find something he'd missed. "And are you familiar with the surveillance video entered into evidence from the ATM on Maple and 9th? "Yes. Elijah asked me to verify the accuracy of the timestamp and its metadata. I examined both the original footage and the internal data from the ATM's transaction logs." Elijah paced slowly. "And what did you find?" "The timestamp is accurate to within 1.2 seconds, and the footage contains embedded metadata from the ATM's network. That metadata includes GPS geolocation, which places the machine at precisely 9th and Maple. At 11:47 p.m., Elijah Carter was there, several blocks away from the burglary in question." A gasp echoed through the courtroom. Elijah turned to Judge Kellerman. "Respectfully, Your Honor, I submit that this is more than circumstantial. We now have a verified location and timestamp that directly contradicts the prosecution's claim." The judge rubbed his chin. "Mr. Carter, I've seen tech evidence dismissed before. Surveillance cameras glitch. Timestamps can be altered." "I agree," Elijah replied, "which is why Mr. Whitaker also pulled transaction data from the ATM's internal memory. The card used matches the one found in my wallet. It logs a balance inquiry at 11:47 p.m. That digital receipt exists within the bank's database." The prosecutor stood quickly. "Your Honor, I need time to review this." Kellerman held up a hand. "I'll allow a short recess." A few members of the audience began murmuring. One of them, a young journalist from the local paper, was already typing feverishly into her laptop. Her eyes flicked between Elijah and Jamal as she formed the headline in her head. "Wrong man on trial, right mind at work." At the defense table, Elijah exhaled, but didn't smile. He hadn't won. Not yet. But for the first time, the burden wasn't solely on his back. The truth was beginning to carry its own weight. As the judge exited and the prosecutor huddled with his team, people began to whisper his name, not as a defendant, but as something else. As someone who didn't just defend himself, he dismantled the accusation, piece by piece, fact by fact. And with every move, the court was starting to realize he wasn't the one on trial anymore. The system was. The courtroom had emptied for the night, but the lights still glowed softly in Judge Raymond Kellerman's private chambers. The shelves were lined with law books bound in cracked leather and gold foil, their spines straight like soldiers. A desk lamp cast a warm circle of light over the oak surface, where a stack of case files sat unopened. But Judge Kellerman wasn't reading, he was watching. On his office monitor, the courtroom footage from earlier that day played on loop. Elijah Carter stood at the center of the screen, questioning, presenting, commanding attention like a seasoned litigator. Kellerman leaned forward in his chair, brow furrowed, eyes narrowed not with judgment, but with something quieter, regret, perhaps, or reckoning. He paused the footage and rewound it to a specific moment, Elijah's calm rebuttal, the moment he submitted metadata that cornered the prosecution. The boy's voice rang in his ears again. "This isn't circumstantial. It's mathematical truth." The judge rubbed his temples and sat back, staring into the flickering image of a young man who had defied every assumption Kellerman had made from the moment he'd entered the courtroom, in handcuffs and an oversized hoodie. He looked over at the edge of his desk, where a framed photo sat quietly. It showed his son, clean-shaven, dressed in a graduation gown, smiling awkwardly next to him. That photo had been taken years ago, before the disappointment settled in, before his son flunked out of law school, before the drinking, the drifting, the quiet rift that widened with each passing year. Kellerman reached for the photo and held it in his hand. "We had every advantage," he muttered, and he walked away from it. He glanced back at the screen. And this one, he's clawing his way toward it. The robe he wore, now draped over the back of his chair, suddenly felt heavy, weighted not by fabric, but by the power it had lent him over the years. The power to believe his first impressions were truth, to believe authority always stood on the right side of justice. Maybe the robe blinded me more than the hoodie ever could, he said aloud, voice rough in the stillness. He thought back to the smirk he had offered Elijah on arraignment day, the sarcasm in his tone. What's next? Harvard law? It had been a throwaway line, but the boy had stood his ground, answered with truth and grace, and never once flinched under the weight of being dismissed. For the first time in decades, Kellerman found himself uncertain, not about the law, but about how easily it could be clouded by perception. He turned off the monitor and sat in silence for a long moment. On his desk, Elijah's motion, typed neatly by hand, still sat in the file. The penmanship was careful, every sentence cited, every argument grounded. Kellerman had seen Ivy League lawyers submit sloppier work. He ran his fingers over the document and thought, maybe this trial isn't about a burglary. Maybe it's about how many times we mistake brilliance for arrogance when it wears the wrong clothes. He reached for a pen and scribbled a note to himself on a yellow sticky tab. Don't judge the argument by the mouth that speaks it. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent to his late-night revelation. But inside that quiet chamber, something had shifted. Not just in the judge, but in the system he served. The final day of trial arrived like the slow build-up before a thunderstorm. The courtroom was packed, not just with reporters and legal observers, but with people from all over the city, law students, pastors, janitors, and teachers, who had heard about the young man in a hoodie who dared to speak law like it was his native tongue. Elijah Carter stood once more at the center of the room, his posture straight, his eyes calm, but his fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. He had reviewed every note, every citation, every second of footage. But today wasn't just about facts. Today was about something more. Judge Kellerman glanced down over the rim of his glasses. Mr. Carter, closing statements. Elijah walked to the center of the courtroom, nodding respectfully to the jury. He didn't carry a stack of notes. He didn't bring a slideshow or a strategy. He brought the truth and his voice. When I first stood in this room, he began, you saw a defendant, a hoodie, a name on a case file. You didn't know where I was coming from. You didn't ask. You didn't have to. Because this system, this courtroom, isn't designed to ask. He paused, letting the silence settle. Even the jurors leaned in. I had every reason to be afraid. The weight of assumptions is heavier than handcuffs. But I stood here because I knew something stronger than fear, the law. The same law that arrested me gave me the tools to fight. And so I used them. He looked toward the arresting officer. I wasn't arrested because I did something wrong. I was arrested because I looked like someone who could have. The prosecutor shifted in his seat, uncomfortable. Elijah continued, his voice softening slightly. The facts were never on their side. I showed you where I was. I proved where I wasn't. And yet, I had to work harder, speak clearer, and defend myself louder, just to be heard. His voice trembled now, not from nerves, but from conviction. This courtroom saw a suspect, he said. I came here to prove there's more beneath skin than suspicion, that your zip code doesn't define your intellect, that your clothes don't cancel your credibility. He turned to the jury, meeting each pair of eyes. I'm not asking for your sympathy. I'm asking for your integrity. If justice is blind, then today is its test, not just for me, but for all the people who walk into rooms like this, wearing the wrong shade of skin or the wrong kind of story. He nodded once and stepped back. The courtroom remained silent as the jury was dismissed. The bailiff led them to deliberation. It didn't take long, less than 20 minutes. When they returned, the foreperson stood, cleared her throat, and read the words that cracked open the tension in the room. On the charge of felony burglary, we find the defendant, Elijah Carter, not guilty. There was a moment of stunned silence. Then, cheers. They erupted from the gallery like an exhale the room had been holding for days. Strangers clapped, some cried. Reporters rushed out to publish the verdict. A young girl in the back whispered to her mother, "He looks like my brother." Judge Kellerman didn't smile, but he gave a single respectful nod. One Elijah returned without arrogance, just quiet strength. Elijah sat back down. He was free. But more than that, he had proved what no system, no badge, and no courtroom could ever take from him again. That brilliance needs no permission, and justice doesn't ask what you're wearing. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered beneath the stone steps where Elijah Carter had just cleared his name. Reporters huddled in clusters, cameras mounted on shoulders, microphones extended toward anyone who had been in the courtroom. The buzz in the air wasn't just about a verdict, it was about a shift, a quiet revolution born from one voice, one case, one hoodie. At first, it was a single video, a grainy clip taken from the gallery. Elijah cross-examining the arresting officer with surgical precision. Then came another, his closing statement powerful and raw, ending with the words, "This courtroom saw a suspect. I came here to prove there's more beneath skin than suspicion." By nightfall, the footage was everywhere. Twitter exploded. TikTok stitched together clips of his statements with audio of applause and civil rights speeches. Hashtags like #justice in a hoodie, #Elijah Carter, and #voice the system ignored began trending globally. Legal blogs published articles titled "A Defendant's Masterclass in Law" and "Meet the Man Who Defended Himself and the Truth." On one viral post, a user wrote, "Harvard dropped a gem. The streets picked him up." News outlets called. First the local station, then national ones. Elijah received a dozen interview requests within hours. Podcasts, law schools, civil rights groups. They all wanted to hear his story. But Elijah didn't rush toward the cameras. Instead, he walked home to his grandmother's apartment. She was in bed, confused. Her memory still fragile. But when he held her hand and said, "I did it," she smiled softly, somewhere between recognition and instinct. The next morning, his inbox was flooded. One message stood out. A well-known pro bono law firm in Washington offered him a full scholarship to finish law school, tuition, housing, books, and mentorship. A second message followed soon after. A non-profit foundation, inspired by his story, announced the Elijah Carter Justice Fund, a scholarship for marginalized youth pursuing law and criminal justice. The tagline beneath the announcement read, "From suspect to symbol, justice wears no uniform." The city buzzed. A mural went up in his neighborhood within days. Elijah, hoodie on, eyes forward, his hand holding a set of legal scales over a cracked gavel. Kids stood around it, taking selfies, asking about the boy from the diner who made the system listen. Elijah, meanwhile, kept quiet. He still worked a few shifts at the diner, still helped his grandmother with her medicine. But when people saw him now, they didn't look through him. They looked up to him. He was no longer a face in a file. He was a mirror for every young person who had ever been misjudged, underestimated, or silenced. He had walked into a courtroom in cuffs. Now, the world was offering him a microphone, and he didn't speak for applause. He spoke because silence had never served him, because the truth had finally found its echo, and because somewhere out there, another kid in a hoodie was watching, learning, hoping, believing that maybe, just maybe, the law could still belong to him too. Months had passed, but the courtroom looked just as it had that first day. Tall ceilings, solemn woodwork, and the same flags that flanked the bench. But today, the air felt different. There were no shackles, no shouting attorneys, no tension coiled beneath polished shoes. Today was not a trial. It was a farewell. Judge Raymond Kellerman stood behind the bench one final time. His robe, freshly pressed, hung from his shoulders like a weight he had learned to carry a little more humbly. He looked older somehow, not in the way age wears skin, but in the way understanding rewrites the lines on a man's face. The room was filled with familiar figures: lawyers, clerks, local politicians, court staff. But at the front row, seated with a quiet confidence, was Elijah Carter. Clean cut now, his hoodie traded for a navy blue blazer. A law school pin gleamed on his lapel. He had accepted the scholarship. He was back in class. But today, he was here for something else. The judge cleared his throat and addressed the room. When I first stepped into this courtroom decades ago, I believed the robe gave me clarity. That law was clean. That justice was a straight line. He paused, letting his gaze settle on Elijah. I've come to understand that sometimes the law needs to be challenged to remember what it's supposed to protect. That truth doesn't always wear the right shoes or the right skin when it walks through those doors. He looked down at the podium, then back up. There's someone here who reminded me of that. A hush fell over the room as he gestured to Elijah. I'd like Mr. Carter to say a few words. Elijah stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked to the center of the courtroom. The very place he had stood alone, surrounded by doubt, once mistaken for a criminal. He looked out over the crowd. I used to think justice was something you had to fight for in the streets, he said, his voice calm. Then I learned you sometimes have to fight for it from within the system itself. He glanced at the judge. We assume power lives in the bench, the robe, the gavel. But the truth is, justice lives in how we use it, or how we challenge it when it fails. He paused, choosing his words with the same care he had shown on the stand. Some people hear the law, he said. Some people speak it. But only when we live it do we honor it. A beat of silence. Then soft applause began, spreading through the room like a rising tide. Some stood. A few wiped away tears. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to clear, Judge Kellerman approached Elijah with a modest cardboard box. These, he said, placing it in Elijah's hands, are mine. Every legal volume I ever trusted, every margin note I scribbled, every text that reminded me law is only as human as the hands that hold it. Elijah looked down at the old books, bent corners, underlined passages, age-worn spines. The judge smiled faintly. You'll put them to better use than I ever did. And with that, he turned and walked away, his steps slow but lighter than before. The courtroom slowly emptied, but one truth lingered behind like sunlight through a cracked door. He walked into court as a defendant, but left as a defender of everything the courtroom forgot to stand for. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the creak of the wooden benches when someone shifted. All eyes were on Elijah Carter as he rose from his chair, stepping toward the jury box with the weight of the world in his chest and the fire of purpose in his veins. He didn't bring notes, no papers, no rehearsed lines. He brought truth, and every second of pain, dignity, and quiet rage that had led him here. I wasn't supposed to stand here, he began, voice low but firm. Not like this, not with a voice, not with a chance. He took a breath, steadying himself. I was supposed to come here in cuffs and leave with a number, not a name. I was supposed to be processed, judged, forgotten. He looked each juror in the eyes, one by one. But you've seen the evidence. You've heard the facts. You know where I was. You know what I didn't do. So now the question isn't about where I was that night. He stepped closer, voice rising. The question is, why did no one ask before locking me in a cage? Why did my hoodie matter more than my ID badge? Why did the system treat me like a threat before it treated me like a human? The gallery held its breath. Not a cough, not a rustle. Even the prosecutor stared. unmoving. "You know what makes this courtroom powerful?" Elijah asked. "It's not the wood, or the seal, or the flag. It's not the robe, or the gavel. It's you, the people, the ones who can still see beyond stereotypes, beyond fear." His voice trembled slightly now, not from weakness, but from the weight of telling the truth when no one expected him to have one. "This courtroom saw a suspect," he said. "I came here to prove there's more beneath skin than suspicion." The words landed like thunder. Elijah stepped back, gave a respectful nod, and returned to his seat. The judge gave instructions to the jury, who filed out of the room with solemn faces. The minutes stretched. 10, 15. Then, less than 20 minutes later, the door opened. The jury returned. Everyone stood. The foreperson rose, a folded paper in her hand, her voice even but unmistakably clear. "On the charge of felony burglary, we find the defendant, Elijah Carter, not guilty." The silence shattered. Gasps, cheers, claps, loud, unfiltered relief rolled across the courtroom like a wave. Some cried. Others stood and applauded. One elderly man near the back muttered, "Finally, something right." Elijah didn't cheer. He closed his eyes, exhaled. His shoulders sank with the release of pressure he'd carried for days, weeks, years. He turned toward the jury and whispered, "Thank you." Judge Kellerman gave a quiet nod. No smile, no speech, just the simple acknowledgement of a truth he now respected. As Elijah walked out of the courtroom, his hoodie still on, but his name now cleared, he wasn't just leaving as a free man. He was leaving as a force the courtroom would never forget. The sun had barely risen over the courthouse steps when the first video hit 1 million views. It started with a clip, blurry, shaky, shot from the back row of the courtroom. Elijah Carter, standing alone, challenging a prosecutor, cross-examining a police officer, holding the attention of a judge, delivering a closing argument that silenced a room full of strangers and stirred a generation hungry for justice. Then came another video, his final words to the jury. "This courtroom saw a suspect. I came here to prove there's more beneath skin than suspicion." Those 16 words lit a match. Within 24 hours, clips of Elijah's trial were flooding every platform. Instagram Reels, TikToks, Twitter threads, legal podcasts, and reaction videos by civil rights advocates and educators around the country. Memes, quotes, and voiceovers spread like wildfire. Hashtags trended overnight. Elijah Carter had justice in a hoodie. She's voiced the system ignored. Defendant to defender. Even celebrities and lawmakers began sharing his story, calling him a symbol of resilience, brilliance, and proof that justice, when demanded smartly and fearlessly, could not be silenced. News anchors called him the modern David, facing a system of Goliaths. Legal commentators described his defense as a law school masterclass performed in real time. Elijah, meanwhile, stayed quiet. He didn't run to the cameras. He didn't seek the spotlight. When reporters first found him, he was sitting quietly on a park bench near the courthouse, feeding pigeons, his hoodie still up, eyes toward the skyline. "I wasn't trying to go viral," he told one interviewer. "I was just trying to go home." But the world wouldn't let him fade into the background. Within days, a prestigious pro bono law firm in Washington, D.C. reached out. They had reviewed every detail of the trial. They didn't just offer praise. They offered Elijah a full scholarship to return to law school, tuition, housing, mentorship, whatever he needed. And then, another surprise. A civil rights foundation, inspired by his story, announced a scholarship fund in his name, the Elijah Carter Justice Initiative, a program to support young men and women from marginalized communities who wanted to study law, policy, or public service. The foundation's tagline, now plastered across social media banners and bus stop billboards, read, "From suspect to symbol, justice wears no uniform." It echoed everywhere, in city halls, on college campuses, in barbershops and school assemblies. Elijah was no longer just a defendant, he was a movement. And still he remained grounded. When asked what came next, he simply replied, law school, then maybe teach or defend someone who never got their turn to speak. He didn't care for fame. He didn't care for likes or followers. What mattered was that the courtroom, his battlefield, had become someone else's blueprint. Because somewhere out there, another kid in a hoodie had just seen Elijah's clip on their cracked phone screen and whispered, "If he can do it, maybe I can too." And just like that, the system had been reminded. A defendant may walk in with doubt on his shoulders, but when truth walks out with him, the whole world follows. The courtroom looked nearly the same as it had the day Elijah Carter stood alone to defend himself. Same faded wood, same solemn silence hanging in the air. But the occasion was different now. There were no bailiffs shifting nervously, no jurors scribbling notes, no prosecutors flipping through manila folders. Today, the courtroom was dressed in reverence. Judge Raymond Kellerman stood behind the bench one final time. He wasn't robed in authority but wrapped in reflection. His hands, once so quick to strike the gavel, now rested gently on the edge of the desk. His voice, once sharp with skepticism, now held the quiet weight of a man ready to let go. He scanned the audience. Old colleagues, city officials, young law clerks, and tucked near the front, dressed in a charcoal blazer with a school pin over his heart, sat Elijah Carter, no longer the boy in the hoodie, but still carrying its shadow proudly. Kellerman took a breath and began. "I've presided over thousands of cases in this room," he said. "I've seen victory. I've seen injustice. I've seen how heavy the law can fall, especially on those the world has already judged before they even speak." He paused, his gaze falling on Elijah. "And I've seen how one voice, honest, brave, prepared, can shift the balance of the entire room." A hush settled. He smiled faintly, something rare. "Before I step away from this bench, I wanted someone else to speak. Someone who reminded me what justice is supposed to look like. Mr. Carter, would you join me?" All eyes turned as Elijah stood. He didn't rush. He didn't grandstand. He walked with the calm of a man who no longer needed to prove anything, only to remind others of what he had become. He turned toward the small podium, looked up at the seal of justice hanging behind the judge's bench, then began. "I remember standing here once, alone, misunderstood and unrepresented, and I remember thinking, if I don't speak for myself, no one will." He glanced toward the back of the room where a group of teenagers sat, wide-eyed, brought in by a local teacher to witness something different about the law today. "Since then, people have asked me, how did I do it? How did I win?" He smiled gently. "But I didn't win. I reclaimed something, my name, my story, my voice." The room was still, hanging on every word. "There are those who hear the law," Elijah continued. "There are those who ask us speak it, but only when we live it, when we challenge, protect, and hold it accountable, do we truly honor it." A standing ovation erupted. Applause thundered off the walls. Kellerman rose, his eyes glassy. After the crowd quieted, he stepped forward carrying a medium-sized box. A simple label on the side read, "Kellerman, Law Library, 1978 to 2023. "These are mine," he said. "Every book I kept, every margin note I scribbled, every reminder that I was always still learning, they belong to someone who will do more with them than I ever could." He handed the box to Elijah. Their hands met briefly, no longer judge and defendant, but elder and successor. The ceremony ended. People filed out, but one man lingered at the doorway, looking back at the empty bench. And Elijah, standing at the center of it all, turned toward the window where sunlight spilled across the floor like a verdict finally made right. He walked into court as a defendant, but left as a defender of everything the courtroom forgot to stand for. The courtroom had seen many things over the years. Tears, confessions, silences that spoke louder than words. But today it held something new, reverence. Not the kind reserved for the law itself, but for the people who dared to question it, reshape it, and live it. The morning light poured through the tall windows of courtroom 3B, casting golden streaks across the judge's bench where Raymond Kellerman now stood for the final time. No longer draped in the robe of daily authority, he wore a modest grey suit and the expression of a man ready to lay down a legacy. The audience filling the seats was not a typical courtroom crowd. No defendants, no anxious attorneys, no bailiffs calling for order. Instead, it was teachers, community leaders, young students, and former colleagues. It was a gathering of those who believed in law and those who had learned to doubt it coming together to witness something rare. At the front, seated with quiet poise, was Elijah Carter. Gone were the handcuffs. Gone was the hoodie. He wore a simple blazer, though the hoodie had not disappeared. It had become a symbol, immortalized in murals, on scholarships, and in speeches. But today, Elijah didn't wear it on his shoulders. He wore it in his story. Judge Kellerman cleared his throat and stepped up to the podium. When I first entered this courtroom decades ago, I believed that the law was everything, he said. That the robe meant truth, that the bench meant wisdom, and that the gavel could never fall wrong. He paused, scanning the room, then resting his gaze on Elijah. But over the years, I've learned something far more humbling. The law doesn't always get it right, and sometimes it takes someone outside the system to remind it what it was built for. A few murmurs of agreement, a stillness of respect. That's why, on this day, my last day on the bench, I've invited someone to speak who changed the way I view this courtroom. Not by force, not by anger, but by doing what most people never do here, reminding us of the truth beneath all the layers. He turned. Elijah rose, stepped up, and for a moment just looked around, taking it all in. The place where it had nearly broken him, the place where he had found the strength to rise. When I first stood here, it wasn't like this, he began. There were no invitations, no microphones, no warm welcomes. A soft laugh echoed from the back. Elijah smiled faintly. I was seen as a problem, not a person. A case number, a profile, a threat. But I came here with one thing the system couldn't take from me, the will to be heard. He glanced at the young students seated in the front row, some no older than he was, when his journey began. And what I learned is this: some people hear the law, some people speak it. But only when we live it, truly live it, do we honour it. The applause came slowly, then rose into a standing ovation. As the room quieted again, Judge Kellerman stepped forward holding a small warm box. I want you to have this, he said to Elijah. My personal law library, 40 years of underlined passages, notes in the margins, and questions I never found answers for. Maybe you will. Elijah took the box with both hands, holding more than just books. He held a legacy being passed, not just from a judge to a student, but from a generation that had looked away to one determined to look harder. As the crowd began to file out and the gavel rested silent on the bench, a single line remained etched in the memory of all who witnessed. He walked into court as a defendant, but left as a defender of everything the courtroom forgot to stand for.